Hello and welcome to today's research seminar on examining the housing approval process across California. My name is Melanie Zauscher and I'm a manager at the California Air Resources Board. Before we get started with the presentation, I want to provide some housekeeping notes and set the context for the study. This seminar is being recorded and will be posted online soon. Please use the chat feature to post your questions during the seminar. You'll be able to ask questions verbally after the presentation is done. And so we'll wait to save all the questions until the end. And thank you. The final report for the study is complete. I will share it through Zoom in a few minutes, and it may take us a few days to put the report actually on CARB's website. This study is an important component of CARB's broader sustainable communities research, which supports our efforts to reduce emissions to help meet California's climate and air quality goals. It also informs our policies to create healthier communities and achieve environmental and health equity across California. CARB's motivation for pursuing this study was driven by its combined efforts to mitigate climate change by reducing transportation emissions, while also helping California overcome the current housing crisis. Senate Bill 375 charges CARB with two key tasks. First, setting regional greenhouse gas reduction targets related to land use and transportation. And second, reviewing sustainable community strategies that describe how these targets will be met. In 2018, CARB published its first progress report on the Senate Bill 375 program and found that California is not on track to meet the greenhouse gas emissions reductions expected under SB 375. Part of the explanation for this is California's past and ongoing growth pattern, whereby jobs and homes are located and built such that people must spend significant time and money driving from place to place. One possible solution is to build more housing in locations that provide close access to key destinations, thus making it possible for people to drive less and use non-auto means to travel. But the current housing crisis reveals slow rates of housing production in these contexts. This study helps to shed light on the reasons for slow housing development in infill areas and examines what this means for social equity. It fills an important research gap that calls for the examination of real-world data to assess if and how land use regulations impact entitlements. It also analyzes processes at local governments and performs a comparative analysis by looking at different contexts found in California, such as urban and suburban areas. We expect that the study will inform not only the SB 375 program, but also other work related to housing, climate, and equity underway at CARB, at other state agencies, and among regional and local governments. It is truly my pleasure and honor to introduce today's speaker, Moira O'Neill. Moira is an associate professor in urban and environmental planning at the University of Virginia. She holds appointments at UC Berkeley and UCLA. Professor O'Neill's interdisciplinary research and teaching focuses on land use, climate, and resilience. Her research examines state and local government efforts to mitigate the impacts of climate change while also addressing inequality. Moira received her Juris Doctor from the University of California, Hastings. Before we move on to the presentation, I would like to sincerely thank the whole research team for their dedication to this study, especially for all the extra effort during the pandemic to actually access the data needed. I also want to acknowledge and thank all the collaborators and reviewers that helped make this study successful. With that, I'd like to pass it off to Moira. I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Melanie, and thank you to everyone who's joined today to hear what I've been working on with a large group of people. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now and make sure that works well. And I'm also going to move off camera. Ideally, everyone can now see my slides. Excellent. So as a starting point, I'm presenting today, but as I think Melanie sort of inferred, this is the consequence of the effort of many, many people There are so many students that also supported this work, in particular the data collection, so many that it's impossible to put them all up on the slide. I do want to note that at least one other member of the team is here on the call with me today, and that is Professor Nick Morantz at UCI. But I will be walking through this presentation and taking you through what we've learned. The report is also available at the moment on SSRN, and so you can access it while we're waiting for it to be available through CARB. So to begin, let's see, there we go. This work is funded not only by CARB, but I want to acknowledge the funders that helped us initiate this work in the first 16 cities that we studied, and that is the Silicon Valley Community Foundation and the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. So fundamentally, the big picture question, what are we trying to understand? The work that I've been engaging on with colleagues for years has been to explore how land use regulation, both state and local land use law, impacts different types of residential development. That includes mixed use development, transit-oriented development, 100% affordable developments, and also exurban greenfield development. We are trying to see how different types of regulations are applied to proposed developments broadly. And this is in response to work that's been going on for decades in urban planning and urban economics. There are many studies that establish that stringency in land use regulation correlates to low housing supply and higher housing costs in high cost metros. And there's also substantial evidence that, at least some local governments use land use regulation to exclude. So those are sort of that is the basis that prompted much of this interest in this work. The limitations of those studies, though, prompted us to design our work in the way that we did. And that is that the prior research is really unable to identify what exact regulation or even type of regulation is responsible for the outcomes that the research does establish. And methodologically, it tends to also sort of sort stringency in terms of metro areas, as opposed to sort of being able to offer insights into specific jurisdictions. So we find that some scholars attribute, for example, supply constraints and affordability problems in California to environmental regulation, whereas others primarily argue that it's density and use controls that fundamentally limit multifamily housing and affordability. So what we try to do in each jurisdiction is to dive into the data to ask and answer very specific questions. How much land is actually zoned for multifamily housing? And I'll explain how we narrow our question even further down the road. We also want to look very critically at how long proposals take to get approved. We also want to understand the pathways to approval. What are the different steps that these different developments need to navigate? And we want to understand how cities are applying state law, as well as how they're applying their own regulation. And we want to be able to create measures to allow us to compare individual cities. So for example, how do neighboring jurisdictions treat exactly the same kind of development? That's really important to us as well. So I've put a link on this slide that does provide access to the report while we're waiting for it to become available on CARB. I also want to note that I've added some content to today's presentation that is not in that report. It's forthcoming, but we are continuously working and have been adding cities to this study. So what is our research design? It is interdisciplinary and draws on multiple different tools. So we do begin our work with fundamentally selecting jurisdictions in response to what other research and other policy writing is identified as important to study and understand. So we selected jurisdictions that policymakers as well as scholars had identified as potentially very stringent or providing a contrast. We also selected jurisdictions that have been identified as being very high cost and having inadequate housing supply despite significant demand. Then we begin our work with traditional legal research, and that's the code summary and base zoning analysis step that then blends in with planning related tools. So we start with trying to read through all of the relevant law applicable to all residential and mixed use development that would yield 5 or more units if built in each of our study jurisdictions. So that's the traditional legal research side, reading zoning ordinances and looking through zoning maps and making sure we have a firm understanding of the relevant state law that's applicable. But then we also grab zoning map shapefiles wherever they are available to calculate the amount of zoned land area available for dense multifamily development, as well as restricted to other uses, for example, single family. Then our next step is to build a data set of observations of how these jurisdictions have approved development that would lead to 5 or more units of housing if it is in fact built, so that we can observe how it navigated through the approval pathway, code that information, and then conduct a series of analyses. And lastly, we do conduct interviews. So in this particular study with what I'm presenting today, in the first 20 jurisdictions that we studied, we did conduct in-depth interviews with 85 stakeholders from different groups that would include affordable developers, market rate developers, local planners and attorneys, sometimes city attorneys, and then outside private planners that might operate as entitlement consultants and lawyers that help navigate development through entitlement, and community-based organizations within each of the study jurisdictions. So in today's presentation, I am going to be focusing primarily on data that relates to entitlements issued in 2014, 2015, 2016, and 2017. We are augmenting our data set, but this is the work I'm presenting on today. So before we began partnering with CARB, we had completed that work in 16 cities, and we added 4 jurisdictions that were likely to entitle exurban development to the data set in order to yield the comparative analysis that I'll share out. I will also share some information about additional jurisdictions specific to the 2014 through 2017 entitlements, and we are augmenting the data set to add additional years. So here are the jurisdictions that we have completed analysis in and those that we are adding. So the first 16 cities are those that are primarily in urban spaces, and then we added Los Angeles County, unincorporated land, Placer County, Roseville, and unincorporated areas in San Diego County in order to examine how greenfield development would navigate entitlement processes in the same metro areas that we had already completed analysis of urban development. We are presently adding more jurisdictions, as you can see on the far right as well. So, how stringent are local regulatory environments? In order to answer this question, we have to begin with our base zoning analysis and then layer in our process analysis. So I'm going to start with the base zoning analysis and walk you through both our methods and findings here. So wherever feasible, as I mentioned, we use spatial analysis of zoning maps to calculate how much land area is in each city is zoned for all income levels. So I'm going to define terms throughout this presentation that are relevant to how we both conduct our research and how we describe our findings. So for example, base zoning analysis is taking all of the different use and zone use districts and planning designations and interpreting them in simplified categories to determine whether or not the density and use controls allow for what we call all income levels. That's the second term on the screen. And that's key to housing element law. There are so many different ways you could do base zoning analysis. You could focus principally on single family only or multifamily housing generally, but we chose this for a reason. And this is partly why I'm sort of visualizing this on the screen. In California jurisdictions that we're studying, sometimes single family only zoning could be as dense as, say, 11 units per acre. And in other places, multifamily zoning could be as low density as 6 units or less per acre. So using categories like single family only and multifamily didn't get us where we wanted in terms of trying to understand what would allow for multifamily housing that could potentially lead to affordability. So we used California's law's default standard of 30 dwelling units per acre in an urban jurisdiction, and all of our study jurisdictions qualified because it's based on population, to determine how much land area was in fact zoned for 30 dwelling units per acre or all income levels. This is I would describe it as a necessary, though insufficient, condition for affordable development. So our next step is then to create these calculations using mapping. So we, as I mentioned, we use these zoning shapefiles to calculate the percentage of all zoned land that is in fact allowing 30 dwelling units per acre or higher. And then that lets us then compare the jurisdictions. This lets us create an apples to apples comparison in cities that otherwise, wouldn't allow for that. For example, what San Francisco might consider to be very dense zoning would be very different than, say, Palo Alto, but this gives us something that we can apply across the board. And we can see here on this chart that in fact, it's quite variable across jurisdictions. So all of these jurisdictions make some land available for 30 dwelling units per acre, but at very different percentages, with, Santa Monica, San Francisco, and Inglewood making more land available at that density and use threshold. And 7 of these jurisdictions making less than 5% of the land area available for 30 dwelling units per acre. So base zoning or density and use restrictions are really important, but they are not the only factor that matters for determining whether or not a jurisdiction's local regulatory environment is going to allow for multifamily housing easily or not. Process really matters as well. Process can add steps to approval. It can add time lags and uncertainty, and it can create a lot of obstacles to development. So key terms here are the distinction between what we call ministerial review and discretionary review. So when a jurisdiction retains discretion over whether to approve a proposed development, or even if the development is subject to the limitations of state law and they have the power to impose conditions of approval, that can create a certain amount of uncertainty, and that can create a time lag to approval. And that's what we're really interested in studying. It's often the subject of study in this field. So again, returning to that legal research, we have, what does the law say on the books? What does the law, how does it read? And so here is a visualization of how the jurisdictions process proposed development based on how their law reads. And on the far left are jurisdictions that we've studied that there is no development, not even a single family housing development, where they would apply a ministerial process. On the far right are the jurisdictions where they would allow for a ministerial process to apply to a proposed development of 5 or more units of housing. Sometimes that is still capped at a particular, it's capped at a particular unit threshold, and other times it's whatever the underlying planning and zoning designations allow for. But notably, once we began to do our data collection, we found that although we had the number of jurisdictions you see on the far right actually creating ministerial processes on the books, we actually only had 2 jurisdictions where we could find observations of the application of a ministerial process to a proposal to develop housing of 5 or more units. Now, for one of the jurisdictions not listed on here, it could be, in fact, that maybe they did have a ministerial process applied, and that would be the city of San Diego. They certainly have the law written in such a way as to allow for that, but they also have what we call staff level discretionary review. And unfortunately, their data tracking did not allow them, they didn't have the information to be able to clarify whether or not the developments, a certain class of developments went through a staff level discretionary process or a ministerial process. So the only 2 jurisdictions where we could verify and confirm that a ministerial process in fact applied were the city of Los Angeles and county of Los Angeles. So what does that mean? It means that in everything that I share with you, when I'm quantifying timeframes or discussing process steps in approval, I'm specifically referring to entitlement and only entitlement. That's what we're studying. We're studying from the time that people apply to have something entitled to the time that it is entitled or receives that final approval so that they can proceed to getting a building permit. We are not comparing entitlements to building permits here. We would have to supplement and augment our data set of entitlements with information about how they then proceeded to get a building permit in order to create an apples to apples comparison. And we do not do that in this particular study. So how long does entitlement take? Well, it really varies. It varies tremendously. And it is remarkable that in some jurisdictions, it exceeds the median timeframes exceed 2 years to entitlement for anything that is 5 or more units, based on what we found in these different in these observations over these years. So you can see that San Francisco takes the longest amount of time. And it's also really interesting to compare San Francisco with its neighbor, Oakland, for example, which is on the other end of the spectrum. So it's interesting to compare those two, because when we did the legal research, the cities appear on the books to be quite similar, but when we see how things play out, they're actually quite different. One big question is, what is it that leads to these lengthy timeframes or variability? We're not so sure that it's CEQA. That is the common point that's discussed. We hear about CEQA a lot, and we've been able to sort of isolate out different kinds of process pathways. So for example, I'm presenting here what happens when we look exclusively at developments that propose somewhere between 5 and 49 units, and they are exempt from CEQA. What are the timeframes like? Well, we see, for example, that in San Francisco, they remain long. They don't really change. And in other jurisdictions that tend to have slightly shorter timeframes, they remain about the same as well. So we think that it's local process that drives these timeframes, as opposed to, say, environmental review. Another reason why we conclude that, though, is because it is very rare for us to see more intensive environmental review processes required for these proposed developments. So we studied 2,000, we have 2,000 observations of proposed developments, and we have very, very few EIRs. We see more exemptions in tiering, and in some jurisdictions, exclusive use of exemptions in tiering, and yet we still see variable timeframes, and in some cases, very lengthy timeframes. So San Francisco has very few EIRs, but it consistently has very long timeframes. So this sort of restates that exact point, but also highlights, for example, that variability also extends into the more intensive environmental review pathways. So San Francisco takes a much longer time than its neighbor, Oakland, in terms of overall medians. But if you're also looking exclusively at processes that involve EIRs, it also takes considerably longer than its neighbor, Oakland. So a proposed development in San Francisco that requires an EIR, the median is 41 months. In Oakland, it's 10 months. And that's pretty consistent with the overall medians. The other important question is whether or not number of approval steps appears to drive these timeframes. Intuitively, it would seem that that would be the case. For example, that a jurisdiction that requires more approval steps would take substantially longer than another jurisdiction that required fewer local approval steps to entitlement. What's remarkable, or at least I found remarkable, is that our data suggests that if we are comparing cities, that's not necessarily the case. The cities with the longer median entitlement timeframes do not necessarily require more approval steps on average. So this is a table that highlights that I'll leave up for a moment so that you can see, but it stands out, for example, that San Francisco, which has the longest median timeframes to approval, is not necessarily requiring more steps to entitlement. And so that is counterintuitive. So how do we compare these cities then, right? So we build from the research that was already in place that often compared regions and metropolitan areas to help us define the concept of stringency. Specifically, for example, we really do use the impressions of how long it takes to approve development in a lightly regulated or more heavily regulated space based on thousands of responses to a survey in the Wharton survey. And that helps us decide what should be the cutoff, for example, for different kinds of categories. So in that particular survey, where thousands of planners across the country are describing their perception of what an average delay is in response to a national land use survey, that survey found that planners nationally perceived an average delay to approval to be about 5 months in places that had an average amount of regulation in terms of restrictiveness, and 8.4 months in places with that were more highly regulated. So they also found that there were outliers, but those outliers were between 15 and 23 months. So that helped guide us with creating categories. So for example, using what we learned in base zoning, but also understanding how other people may define stringency based on this other research, we created 4 categories described as permissive, moderately stringent, very stringent, and prohibitive. And so a permissive regulatory environment would be one in which a city has more than 20% of its zoned land area for all income levels, and the median timeframes would be 5 months or less. A moderately stringent environment would have more than 5% of its land area zoned for all income levels, and median timeframes would be lower than 8.4 months. Or they would have more than 20% of their land area zoned for all income levels and timeframes of at or less than 15 months. So we have some fluidity there to account for the balance between density and use controls and time lags. And then in the context of very stringent, a jurisdiction that has more than 5% of its zone land for all income levels, but its timeframes exceed 8.4 months, but are less than 2 years, we would put in the very stringent category. That would be pretty consistent with the outliers in terms of planner responses. And then lastly, there's the category of what we would describe as a prohibitive jurisdiction, where a jurisdiction makes less than 5% of its land area zoned for all income levels, or it could be either, or it could be both, or median timeframes are greater than 2 years. We consider that to be a more prohibitive regulatory environment. When the timeframes are greater than 2 years, they now exceed even the perceptions of what it takes to get to approval in highly regulated places based on planner perceptions across the country, thousands and thousands of responses. So it's just so beyond the norm, so to speak. So how do we then categorize and place our cities? We use these 2 measurements. We use our base zoning analysis and our median timeframes to place these different cities within these categories. And we see that some of our larger cities fall into a prohibitive category. And among them includes San Francisco and San Diego. So what does this mean in terms of entitlement? Interestingly, we also see really big differences in terms of how much these different jurisdictions actually entitle. So here's an example of how we can standardize our counts. So I could show you, and it's in the report, we have tables that give you actual counts, the actual units and number of development approvals that each of these jurisdictions issued in the study years. But when you're comparing cities of a very different size, that's not necessarily giving you a good sense of how much they're approving. We want to be able to see how much Oakland, which is much smaller in terms of population, is approving relative to, say, Berkeley or San Francisco, or how Los Angeles and Santa Monica compares also requires somehow being able to standardize given the difference in their sizes. So we use, in this example, per capita. We use population to help understand how many units these jurisdictions are in fact entitling. And we see that Oakland and Mountain View are in the lead. They are comparatively entitling much more housing compared to these other study cities, but also in comparison with their neighbors, which is the next sort of stage of looking at this. To really sort of understand how jurisdictions are performing in terms of approving housing in relationship to each other, it is also important sometimes to isolate them out by metro and to look at them in the context of the areas in which they're situated, because those are specific regional economies. And so it helps us understand how they're doing within the context of demand that exists in that space. So we can see here, for example, that Oakland and Redwood City are approving more per capita than San Francisco. Now, of course, San Francisco's physical size, it's not surprising that units per square mile, it's much higher. And we also sort of see the same outcome with Mountain View relative to San Jose and Palo Alto. We do think, in fact, here's this in Los Angeles as well. We do think that it is local regulation that is probably contributing to why some of these cities in the same areas are entitling more relative to their neighbors. And this is basically placing Los Angeles, Santa Monica, Pasadena, Long Beach, and Redondo Beach next to each other. And we can see that Los Angeles is entitling the most. Although if you can go back to the Bay Area, we can see that the Southern California jurisdictions are nowhere near Oakland and Mountain View. So supply and how much they entitle is not the only question we want to answer. To engage the topic of equity, we want to understand how many affordable units, for example, are these jurisdictions entitling, and importantly, where are they going? Where are they approving affordability? And so we use a lot of different tools to try to understand that. Again, we return to spatial analysis to explain where these deed restricted affordable units are going. And the base layer that you see on the screen is not one that we created. This is an example of where we layer our own data on top of existing analytical tools that are out there. So in this instance, I'm drawing here from the maps that are available from, basically it's called TCAC, but the tax allocation committee, sorry, I'm not stating the acronym correctly, but these tools compare different areas within a given jurisdiction based on resources across multiple dimensions. So they combine a variety of metrics in terms of education outcomes and various income and various other different attributes of opportunity together to designate an area as more or less opportunity, using terms like highest resource, high resource, moderate resource, low resource, and high segregation and poverty. So this is something, for example, that is readily available online. These are not, the opportunity maps are not something, as I mentioned, we create. There's something that's readily available to everybody. And so what we do is just pull from them and then layer our data to explore the relationship of affordability to opportunity, which then lets us essentially calculate the number or percentage of units that end up in areas of opportunity. So one of the challenges of this, of course, is that the spatial analysis is most meaningful in cities with a mix of lower and higher opportunity areas. So that's the example of San Francisco that I'm showing you. It becomes a little less meaningful if a jurisdiction is sort of designated entirely as higher opportunity, in that it doesn't really tell you anything about what's going on within the boundaries of the jurisdiction. But in the context of San Francisco, it's quite informative, because we know that in San Francisco, 2% of all the deed restricted affordable units are located within the highest or high opportunity or highest or high resource areas. That's an interesting outcome, and relative to Los Angeles, it's much lower. So Los Angeles does far better. It's over 20% of deed restricted affordable units that make their way into the higher or highest opportunity areas. So here is where we see the comparison across jurisdictions. And again, this sort of illustrates where this is helpful and where it may not be necessarily helpful. So the Santa Monica jurisdiction, of course, 100%, because everything in Santa Monica is classified as a higher or highest opportunity area. But in the jurisdictions where you have lots of different possibilities, it is really interesting to see San Francisco versus Los Angeles. It opens up important questions about what's happening within those local regulatory environments, and why is this an outcome, in terms of these two different places. Another important question that we want to answer that is relevant for issues around equitable development is what is potentially being demolished to make way for new housing. Particularly in an infill context, demolition is a really likely outcome in jurisdictions that approve most proposed development on already residential use land. So in some of the jurisdictions we study, almost everything that we studied, almost every single entitlement was on a formerly commercial or vacant parcel. And in other places, for example, in some of the Southern California jurisdictions, almost everything we studied was on land that was already used for residential purposes and had existing residential buildings. So we do explore demolition trends, and we look carefully at what's being demolished, whether it's commercial demolition or residential demolition. This here is referring to residential demolition. And where rent stabilization is relevant, because the local jurisdiction has an ordinance in place, we do in fact calculate the number of units that were rent stabilized that are demolished. And then we look to see what's coming in place of it. And so these two graphs show you the different jurisdiction names, but they do make it very difficult to sort of compare the demolition activity in relationship to what's coming next. So I have another visual to sort of show the different outcomes. But this is a more effective way to explain that for the most part, for example, where there is substantial demolition activity, and that would be in Los Angeles, for example, there's exponentially more housing being built on the areas in which there's demolition activity. So that is an outcome that we can see with the top green bar. What we also can see, though, is that even though there is exponentially more housing coming in, the demolition does involve a high rate of rent stabilized units being demolished and not necessarily a high rate of affordable units coming in. I do want to be very clear that a deed restricted affordable unit and a rent stabilized unit are not equivalencies. And for example, the demolition of a rent stabilized unit, while it would absolutely, I mean, it's very unlikely that it doesn't involve physical displacement. It's more likely than not that it does, because it often involves also an eviction that we were able to track. That doesn't necessarily mean that the displaced household would qualify for the deed restricted affordable housing. So they're two different types of housing stock, but we do think it is important to recognize that there's a potential loss of affordability with the rent stabilized housing unit. There's certainly a high risk of physical displacement and not necessarily an equivalent return in terms of affordable units. So that's sort of the big takeaway. We know that in some cities, most entitlement involves development on housing, on spaces with existing housing. That's going to require demolition. This is sometimes going to involve the demolition of rent stabilized apartments. We know that more units will come in than the original housing in almost every instance, but we also know that most of those units will primarily be market rate units. That's based on the observations we've studied. So moving now to another important topic of interest for us is returning to the theme of how do these developments navigate environmental review. As I sort of described earlier, environmental review in particular is a very hot topic in the discussion of what stalls development. So it was of interest to us to try to parse out what's happening with environmental review. And we found in our data, for example, that very, very few entitlements that we studied required EIRs. So one of the next things we wanted to understand was, okay, there are only a few that require EIRs, but where are those entitlements located if they do in fact require EIRs? And so we are here layering on our entitlement data, for example, in the city of San Diego. We've created a base layer underneath using census data that just provides density and color coding these observations of entitlements based on their environmental review pathway. So the green represents, the deeper green represents exempt or tiering being applied to the entitlement, and the yellow represents the EIRs. And in the city of San Diego, we don't have very many instances of EIRs. So we find that very little proposed development in cities overall require EIRs, and we're just visualizing this for one city. But then we want to contrast it with what's happening in the counties that are in the same metros, particularly in the unincorporated area. And so we find that actually the pattern is the same. So in the county of San Diego, that seems to be equally true. There's very little development or entitlement that requires an EIR that we observe in these same years with these approvals. What this also may mean, though, is that we have this development going into higher fire risk areas, and we have less intensive environmental review. So we find that almost everything is tiered in the county of San Diego, but in fact, the vast majority of the units also end up being cited if they are built in a very high or high fire risk area. So the next point of interest for us, of course, also in relationship to decades of research in this space, is how community opposition can emerge. So people who are in opposition to a proposed development can oppose the approval of a proposed development through a local administrative appeal, and they can also bring a lawsuit. So we did analyze our data to observe how often this is happening. And I'll share out some of the findings. There's a lot more in the report, but what we found, one of the most surprising findings for us was that, in fact, litigation was not that frequent. So out of the 2,000 observations or approvals that we studied, less than 3% of them actually faced opposition through litigation. Now, the rates for administrative appeals are higher than that. Administrative appeal referring to the local level appeal, not in an appeal that follows a trial court determination. And we also found that only one of the 100% affordable developments within our data set actually faced litigation. So there were a total of 83 across all of the 20 jurisdictions. Only one of them faced litigation. We also found that there seemed to be about the same rate of litigation in both the urban cities that we studied and in the counties and city likely to approve exurban development. So there didn't seem to be much of a difference there, at least in terms of the project approval litigation rate. What we also found, though, is that litigation definitely, of course, impacts more units in urban cities than in jurisdictions approving exurban developments. So you see a much higher rate of units that are impacted by this litigation as compared to exurban development. We also found that litigation rates were slightly higher in higher opportunity census tracts as compared to the lower opportunity ones. So again, using the TCAC maps. And another important finding was that although we only had 4.5% of all of our project approvals requiring EIRs, we had a pretty high rate relative to other CEQA pathways facing litigation. So 23% of all the approvals that required EIRs faced litigation. And in contrast, with respect to exemptions, less than 1%, right, it faced litigation. So that is interesting to us in terms of the fact that there seems to be more litigation with the developments that did require EIRs, and it opens important questions about what's happening there. Questions we can't necessarily answer with our data, but I think invite really important questions for future research. The next thing that we also thought was interesting is that although CEQA claims are very common, we found that 67% of all of the different petitions, or all of these different litigation matters involved CEQA claims. They also had local land use claims, or we had basically both at present. So we did have some, of course, we had some cases that involved only CEQA claims, but most importantly, we had more than 2/3 of these lawsuits that could have proceeded even if there were no CEQA claims. Another sort of important finding is that although the litigation was infrequent, we did observe that it added substantial time to overall development timeframes. So, for example, if an entitlement did have to go through litigation process, it typically added about 2 more years to the overall entitlement timeline. And if that trial court decision was then appealed, it could add 6 years to that entitlement timeline. So although it's infrequent, it can create very lengthy timeframes for those developments that actually do face litigation. So what are sort of our insights overall? There are many in the report, but I'm going to summarize a few that I've covered today. And probably one of the most significant is that even in cities that have inclusionary policy, in other words, where the law on the books indicates a desire to improve fair housing, to increase fair housing and to achieve fair housing goals and to improve on affordability, there appears to be prohibitive local law. And I think that says that cities really have to scrutinize how they're actually applying their local regulation if they're going to achieve their housing and affordability goals. They're going to need more accurate data on how they're processing these proposals to develop housing, and
and we did find, in fact, that very few of them had great data readily available or seemed to be, able to do that analysis on their own. Another important finding is that zoning more land for dense multifamily housing is necessary, but it appears to be a very incomplete, step towards increasing production. It's not the only problem that affordability will face. So, for example, there are extreme, cases in Berkeley, Santa Monica, and San Francisco of onerous process requirements that would really limit how much development could move through their system, including affordable development. And, this is in relationship to essentially preventing any development moving through a ministerial process or even sort of an accelerated process, because there are so many discrete requirements that allow for development to be delayed, even if it is going to ultimately be approved, and there are multiple opportunities for opposition. Another factor that we think requires continual attention is the demolition issue. While we wouldn't necessarily suggest that any city should, we should prevent demolition, we would just say that we should always have really good data on when new housing is going to involve the demolition of existing housing stock, so that the trade-offs are readily apparent. So, for example, if new housing is going to demolish rent stabilized multifamily housing, we should know where that's located, and ideally we should know who's living in it, so that we can identify where the displacement impacts are going to derail the overall sort of fair housing goals that that jurisdiction or the state has. We should make sure we have really good policy in place to accommodate any family that could, or any household that could be displaced. And we can't know any of that if we don't have really good data. The other thing I think that's really important to call out that we found is that all of the jurisdictions we've studied are producing the type of data that we collected, coded, and analyzed here in their regular work. Nothing that we coded is outside of the scope of what they do when they're processing proposed development. But very few of the jurisdictions we studied actually manage this data very well. In fact, only 2 of the jurisdictions that we've studied manage this data well. We recognize that at least some of these jurisdictions would need technical and financial support to improve data management, but the most significant takeaway for us is that better data is ultimately going to help us craft better policy. We think that we found outcomes in certain cities that are in direct, they are directly contradicting what those jurisdictions are stating at the outset they would like to accomplish. So we do think that better data could help local governments do a better job implementing their own housing policy and their own climate policy goals. We don't think all of the jurisdictions we studied are intending to exclude per se. It's that I think sometimes there's a mismatch between what they're actually what's actually occurring within the jurisdiction as opposed to what they're outwardly saying. And we also think in order for us to understand how state law is operating in these varied local contexts and whether current law and recent changes to state law are operating as intended, we need better data out of these local governments. And by better data, I am referring to data that can be quality checked. I'm not referring to just self-reported data on housing approval processes, but data that allows for auditing and for confirming what's being reported out. I want to note the limitations of the study. It's really important to do that. I need to highlight that the time frame and zoning findings that I've just shared out are limited to the specific cities and the counties that I presented on those earlier slides that we've studied. We also did not study denials. We did not study how and when these jurisdictions deny proposals to build housing. We are only examining projects that actually made it to entitlement. In other words, we can explore project approval delays, but we can't tell you about projects that didn't make it to entitlement. We also are not comparing timelines for discretionary ministerial projects. As I noted at the outset, only 2 of the jurisdictions that we studied had observations of ministerial approvals. So we don't compare the 2. It's not an apples to apples comparison without augmenting the data set of entitlements, because the ministerial project is going to end with a building permit in terms of the approval process, and the discretionary project ends with the entitlement that happens prior to getting a building permit. And lastly, although I didn't dive into what stakeholder interviews said, I do want to note that anything we have in the report that references stakeholder interviews is limited by the fact that these are voluntary participants. So anytime there's voluntary participation in interviews, that always increases selection bias, and it limits the generalizability of the findings, because even within the study's geographies, because of the fact that it is voluntary participation. So the last thing I wanted to share is that we have a website. It is continuously being updated on a daily basis, but it will allow for you to explore some of what we're doing with an interactive mapping tool. So you can explore different jurisdictions on your own and look at the process observations relative to different kinds of features you might be interested in. This right here is sharing out San Francisco. It's an example of how you can click on an observation and see details. It also shows you how you can modify the time frame to see all of the observations that actually involved entitlement within a year. And then you can look at whether the development was code compliant, in other words, conforming to local land use requirements and so on. Lastly, this is the website address that you can go to start to explore it. And these are my email addresses if you want to correspond with me at any point to ask a follow-up question. And I'm going to stop sharing now so that we can move into questions. And I'm going to go back to.
Thank you so much, Mara. That was a great presentation. Very timely, very interesting. So what we're going to do now is, pardon me, there's a few questions that were asked in the chat. I'm going to give those folks first dibs to ask questions. And then if you pardon me, are interested in asking a question, please raise your hand as well. So Elias, you seem to have a lot of questions. And also when you please ask your question, if you could introduce yourself and any affiliation you may have. Thank you.
Yes, Elias Cortez. I'm a retired cabinet secretary for the state of California. I ran the technology with the state, also with the county of San Bernardino and LA Unified. I've been working with City of El Monte since 2003, and they've been very progressive in inviting multifamily housing. They're the leaders in developing housing for veterans and quite a bit more. One of the things that I've been working with various cities on in this housing area is that it doesn't matter who your city attorney is and how much expertise that they have in real estate development. And that's where I think that most cities, if they don't have a strong real estate expert on board, it's very difficult for those cities to go through a smooth process in working with developers. Thinking out of the box, planning and permitting all involved with the process are really the areas where on the city staff, they need to strengthen their skill sets so that they can help streamline this. But the other thing I've noticed in working with these small, medium to small cities is that there are still financial institutions that are not proactively investing in disadvantaged communities or opportunity zones. And it's become a big challenge for development to really gain speed, if you will. And there are also certain communities. I lived in Chino Hills. They're anti-development. They've been in lawsuits for a while. But the bottom line is, I think that CEQA needs to be streamlined. More education around CEQA needs to be processed. I think that is a big hurdle, but also helping the small to medium cities with best practices for development and housing is critical, especially now with rural communities being looked at as one of the fastest growing areas for housing development. So what can be done to improve the process, I guess, is the question.
So I don't know that our data would lend itself to the jurisdictions you've identified or the specific questions you're raising or comments you're offering about particularly the finance component and so on, because we limited our analysis to regulation. We were narrowly focusing on the role that regulation can play in shaping development outcomes in specific jurisdictions. We don't focus on that because we think that regulation is the only determining factor in terms of development patterns or outcomes. We just narrowly focused on the role that regulation plays in response largely to existing research that calls out regulation as playing a huge, it being a huge contributing factor to what gets developed and where. I think though that what you're describing and discussing actually extends outside of the type of land use regulation that we studied. And certainly you're talking about also jurisdictions that we didn't study. So I wouldn't really be able to offer any insights into those specific jurisdictions because they weren't in our study group. So I'm not sure if there's something else that I can answer though.
Well, you don't need to answer it. I think CARB needs to look at the solution for improving housing development more holistically, and specifically look at it because many of the programs that are coming from the state are talking about and quoting disadvantaged communities, yet implementing housing projects in those communities take a lot longer than even 2 years in many cases. So I believe that CARB needs to look at statewide where the opportunities lie, and then look at the elephant in the room, financing for these projects. Thinking out of the box, like taking a mall in the city of San Bernardino, who's been vacant for decades, and converting it to a mixed-use development. So there's a lot of opportunities that lie out there, but it seems that the housing model that's being looked at is not being looked at holistically from the perspective of disadvantaged communities and the most needy that need the housing now.
Thank you, Elias. I appreciate your comments. We'll see if this is more of a research study we can do in the future or incorporate in a future study, or if this is more of a policy analysis that wouldn't necessarily be done through an external research. But I appreciate your comments and we are paying attention. Julian, I think you were next. Julian Fuentes.
Hi, my name is Julian Fuentes, and I'm affiliated with the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California. Obviously, I'll just kind of state the obvious that this isn't in your area to fix or anything, but I do just want to point out that my experience in my area within Riverside County has been that there's this development going on under the guise of affordable housing, but in fact, I'm not sure who it is actually affordable for, especially when we're considering underrepresented populations. It doesn't appear that there's anything that's really affordable for anybody who's making minimum wage or under minimum wage. So just want to throw that out there for everyone. But my two comments that I had was, or a question that I had was, is there a reason why only certain cities or counties were included in this study?
Yes, I think there's the not so fun answer, and then there's the methods answer. So the approach that we took is case study approach. So we identified jurisdictions that we were interested in studying based on both the fact that we wanted to conduct case studies and that were in-depth case studies. And then we also looked to other policy documents and research that identify jurisdictions and metro areas where demand outstripped supply and the costs were high and supply was typically too low. We started there and then moved to other regions where there was a little bit more balance historically. And then, resources. So in terms of the number of jurisdictions, that's dictated by resources. And so you have, you sort of have a long list and you have them in priority based on the research. And then the resources dictate how many of those on the list you can actually study. So that's why it's at 20 and it's why those first 20.
Okay, I understand. Thank you.
course.
My other comment has to do with, I mean, obviously CARB is pushing for good reason for us to, you know, reduce air contaminants. And that definitely impacts underrepresented communities differently, and is more impactful. So my question is, you know, as we're moving to build all of this infrastructure that's going to take a lot of land and use a large footprint, you know, to have areas where we do plug vehicles in or have other alternative fuels available. You know, there's some issues going on with our infrastructure, with our electrical infrastructure. And it doesn't seem like anybody is really looking at that or addressing that issue. We're just moving forward with new technology and hoping that it's all going to work out. This also would impact any housing that's developed, because now there's laws in place that say that there has to be solar included in these construction projects, in my area anyways. So given that issue and our infrastructure maybe not being reliable enough to support all the building that's going on, we have another piece to this, which is our water. And we're in a tough spot right now, mandating restrictions on water use, but yet we're continuing to build, and those you know, the housing is going to need those supplies, right, of water and electricity. So I'm just wondering if that's factoring into any studies.
So that is outside the scope of what I focus on. I mean, so how I would engage with that would be sort of a second stage analysis. So if there are other researchers out there that, for example, completed spatial analysis that showed any information about infrastructure or water access or other types of indicators that you just described, then our team would likely layer our data right on top of that to see what's happening if in fact there was that kind of spatial analysis in the jurisdictions we studied. But nobody on the team I'm on is actually pulling that information directly. So I don't have, a great answer for you in terms of ongoing work in that space, but possibly Melanie or one of her colleagues does.
Okay, thank you for your responses.
Of course.
Yeah, I don't know of any study that's looking at this in particular, and I don't think we have any in the queue. But I know, at least when looking at EV, electric vehicle charging specifically, there are researchers, and I think maybe CEC is also looking at that. Where is infrastructure most available to put the chargers, which is different than the housing question, I realized. I also wanted to ask Emma, who is managing more of the housing contracts at CARB at the moment, if maybe they can provide a quick overview of a couple other contracts that are related to a previous question. Emma, sorry to put you on the spot.
Oh, no problem. Yeah, thank you, Melanie. I was just thinking in response to Elias Cortez's comments earlier in the conversation about other research avenues. So just take the opportunity to highlight Nick Morantz is on the call now and is working on a parallel project which tackles some of this issue regarding where opportunities are for more housing construction in transportation efficient, healthy, high opportunity areas. That work is still underway. I think there's about another 2 years left in that contract. And so we are certainly thinking about this parallel question of where could housing development of the likes that the state needs to see, where is that occurring. And the second project that will be kicking off in just a couple weeks is considering potential financing mechanisms for new housing construction. So how can the state really catalyze new housing development? And I know that Suzanne Haig conceived of this topic. Suzanne, if you're on the line and wish to chime in, please feel free to do so. But I just wanted to highlight those two and really appreciate the comments in general around useful potential research directions here at CARB. We're always trying to be responsive to what folks in the broader community of practice and policy are needing. So thanks very much.
Thanks, Emma, for calling on me. And I'll just add very quickly to not take us too far off topic that yeah, we have several studies in the works about both what are the impediments to housing construction that are less in the regulatory sphere. So that's what this study is focusing on, is the regulatory impediments. And then what are some potential solutions at the state level? I won't go into too much detail on those, but happy to follow up with anybody afterwards if you'd like more detail. But on the question that was raised about energy and water and sort of infrastructure related supports for affordable housing or housing production in general, I think is a really apt question, and not something that, as far as I'm aware, CARB has specific research focused on that is active at this moment, but definitely an important question. So I believe it was Julian who raised the question. If you have ideas of, as Emma suggested, future research that we might embark on to help answer those questions, again, happy to follow up afterwards.
Thank you, Emma and Suzanne. Stephen, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Let me put my hand down real quick. Now, I want to ask the question. I usually ask the questions and nobody asks. Look, I advocate for the poor, okay? The homeless, the disenfranchised, the disabled. And I noticed while your study is very, very specific, it doesn't look like at the people that need to be looked at. And could another study be done? For instance, the people I deal with are so fed up with going to the counter and the fees that your study looks at, they don't care anymore. Guess what? They're just building in their backyard. Even if the city has an ADU, it's so expensive for the fees. They're saying we don't care. And that impacts our air quality. And I applaud these people because they're fed up, because their kids and families are homeless. I have 3 generations in my house, 3 generations. Okay, so is there anything in this study, or are you proposing to look at anything study that people are just saying, you know what, look at Huntington Park. LA and all LA County had to change its laws because so many people across the county just built their garage into a place. Some of them became unsafe. Some of them were better than what the county or city expected. But people are just going to build. Okay, they're tired. They're tired of CARB using CEQA or air quality to say that people of color can't move into a certain neighborhood. I'm just going to say it. People don't like to hear it, but it's used against us all the time. I grew up in Compton, in South Central, in a 600 square foot house with 9 of us behind a junkyard. I have lung problems as well as heart problems, but guess what? I'm not homeless, and neither are my kids. But we know so many people that are homeless because the regulation looks at what's best for Santa Monica and not what's best for Compton and not what's best for the Inland Empire. We need housing. People are desperate and they're just going to build it. I once told when I spoke before the Federal Reserve, it said, you know what? We're going to do it because we're poor. We're used to this. So are you looking at any studies or proposed studies or implementing regulations or something to tell cities, guess what? People are just doing it with or without your approval, because that study needs to be done because it's impacting our traffic, it's impacting our air quality, but it's also preventing homelessness. It's also creating affordable housing that if we follow what CARB says and we follow what our local government says, every place we rent is going to cost $3,000. But if my neighbor down the street converts his garage for his kid and doesn't say anything, he could save $500 a month. So are we looking at this, or is there a proposal to look at it? Because somebody needs to ask the questions that are out of the box and kind of scary to some people, to say, we need to look at it because it's being done. It's being done all over California. People are just fed up. Anyway, if not, I'm proposing that. Thank you.
Well, I appreciate the proposal, definitely. I can tell you about two pieces of I think there's still active research that I know colleagues at UC Berkeley have been engaged in that might relate, although I think what you're speaking to might go even beyond what they're doing. But I do know that the Turner Center did have a study dealing with fees, specifically they were dealing with impact fees. We didn't include that in our work, just because it's another very involved step. Again, and sometimes scopes, unfortunately, are just curtailed or limited by resources. And it's just, that's how it plays out in how you design your study. And then I also know that there has been work to look at implementation of ADU ordinances, which could possibly touch on that if it explores permitting after the fact, right? Like, for example, if somebody goes to a jurisdiction to get a permit for something they already built. But I think what you're asking about is active research to explore the development of housing outside of the permitting process, right? Where people are rehabbing a space within their existing structure or building something, in their rear yard to expand housing opportunity, but not going through the city. And we don't engage with that in this particular study. I would say that particularly it's come up in a different study I'm involved with that's outside of housing, particularly in rural spaces, that there is actually a lot of activity around just building structures, without going through formal permitting processes. But that's my only sort of exposure to it. And I would agree with you that it is a worthwhile endeavor to explore what's happening within these same, areas of interest. Possibly somebody else on the call, though, may be aware of related research that touches on what you're interested in.
Yeah, I'll just chime in briefly. I think it's a great point. I am aware of some relevant work that is trying to find ways to enable lower income and moderate income homeowners to navigate the approvals process for accessory dwelling units more effectively. And I can put that, it's being done by a colleague at UCLA, so I'll put that in the chat as well.
Thanks, Nick.
Thank you both, Moira and Nick. Appreciate that. And Stephen, thank you for raising those concerns and comments. And as Emma said, we are really trying to think about what research to fund in the future. And this sounds like a good place to start. So if it's okay, maybe we will reach out to you to talk more in depth. John, I believe you had your hand up next.
Hi, thank you. I'm John Butler with CARB, and I'm in the team that looks at sustainable community strategies. And I think this is a fascinating study, and thank you for the really informative presentation. One thing that stuck out to me was that despite its really onerous process, San Francisco looks fairly good compared to other cities, not all cities, but to a lot of cities. Even compared to Oakland, it's not that far below Oakland in the number of units entitled per capita. But even though, they're obviously these cities are just across a bridge or tunnel, the demand for housing in the two cities is not the same. And I was wondering, is there a way to measure, or that you did measure, the need for housing compared to the entitlements issued? Maybe by thinking about the jobs housing balance, or say the students housing balance when we think about Berkeley. And this could get at the question of maybe how many units were not built in a city that might have a high demand. So maybe the number of units foregone due to the issues you studied. And then that would lead us to the additional, in the end would lead us to maybe thinking about additional greenhouse gas emissions or vehicle miles traveled produced when that housing that is not built in those cities is then built in areas where people have to drive longer distances. So I haven't read your study yet. I'm looking forward to it, but I wondered if you covered that or if that could be covered.
So we didn't create any type of measurement of demand. We relied on prior research to identify jurisdictions and metros where demand routinely outstrips supply, and then selected our cities accordingly. So of course, San Francisco was very much at the top, right? In terms of jurisdiction where demand. I think the report that we relied on at the beginning of our study came out of the Legislative Analyst's Office. It was a 2015 report that sort of placed cities and metro areas in sort of a ranking order in terms of supply outstripping demand, or I'm sorry, demand outstripping supply, and then balancing out and so on. I did want to note that actually in terms of the metric per capita, Oakland is, I think, twice as the rate of San Francisco in terms of entitlement per capita. So it's doing a lot more if we're standardizing in that way than its neighbor San Francisco in terms of approval. That doesn't necessarily mean though that everything will get built. We haven't completed that all of the analysis that would look at that, but we did explore, you know, the amount of we did a first pass at looking at what was entitled and how much of it was moving to a building permit process. And we do see that in San Francisco, virtually everything that gets entitled, people apply for a building permit, which was not necessarily true in all of the other jurisdictions that we studied. I hope that's responsive, John. I'm not sure if.
Thanks.
I can also just jump in to supplement this with actually some other research that Moira has done, which is in conjunction with Chris Elmendorf at UC Davis and Eric Bieber at UC Berkeley and Paavo Munkanen at UCLA, looking at ways of defining whether jurisdiction appears to be constraining housing development. And so they've come up with a measure of what they call presumptive constraint. And I can put a link to that paper in the chat as well.
Thank you, Nick.
Thanks, Nick. Melinda, you're next.
Hi, Moira.
Hi, Melinda.
Hi, Melinda Coy from HCD. I was wondering, so you had a slide at the very end about some of the conclusions that you're drawing, and obviously, you know, the study was time limited or time bound to up to, I think, was it 2017 building permits?
The first 20 is 2017 entitlements, unless a jurisdiction had a ministerial process, where it would only be a building permit, right? But we have been, the newer jurisdictions, we've gone through 2020. I just didn't put it up in this presentation.
Okay. I was just wondering if, I mean, in your study, I haven't completely read through, but if you posit anything as it relates to some of the newer laws that have been passed since then, since, for example, SB 330 requires the replacement of all demolished units on a one-for-one basis, and if they're, you know, if they have rent control, that those get replaced at those affordability levels. So I was just wondering, like, how you balance like your recommendations with kind of like the new laws that obviously are not reflected in the data, because there's been a lot of change in the past couple of years around this area.
Right. Well, I mean, I think the primary recommendations flow from the big takeaway that we need really good data to actually see whether these laws are operating the way we want them to. So the new jurisdictions that I've studied don't actually include the same rates of demolition activity as, say, Los Angeles, Pasadena, San Jose. But I would suggest that carefully tracking what's happening within those jurisdictions that I just mentioned to see if, in fact, demolition activity is still occurring, and if so, what kind of replacement, you know, what kind of replacement units are getting approved is pretty essential. So of those, I would be exploring that now in Pasadena, but we haven't augmented San Jose or the city of Los Angeles completely. But it would, in my mind, be a natural extension of the work to see actually how SB 330 is operating. And the other sort of related thing that I don't have ready findings for you today, but I will later this year. I am looking at the impact of SB 35 in the jurisdictions that we've studied already. So, you know, I'll be producing a paper. I mean, I knew that.
Very interested in that.
Yes, exactly. So Nick and I and other colleagues are all part of sort of a paper writing series where, and the paper that I will produce will look at the impact of SB 35 in the jurisdictions. And so, you know, I don't have ready findings for you today, but I will have something for you later this fall.
That's really exciting. Please contact me as you need for that. So.
But, you know, I do think that as we continue to, my colleagues and I call for better data and see a need to continue to do this work right now. But ultimately, you know, we also see movement, right, with reporting with the APR that hopefully will also get us to a place where we can start monitoring this through the annual progress reports as well, you know, so that we can answer all of these questions.
Well, I just want to say how much I appreciate the study. It's been very informative, at least all the preliminary stuff in our work related to housing elements and being able to identify jurisdictions where we need to dig a little deeper. So thank you very much. And thank you for this presentation.
My pleasure.
It looks like we also have a comment from Linda Wheaton. I don't know if you would like to read your comment out, or if you have a question, but if not, I can read it for people who don't have the chat. We like to read things, so give you the chance.
Thank you. I was just pointing out for the participant who was making the case for, I mean, talking about all the problems, the affordability issues and permitting and so forth. SCAG in its current outreach for REAP 2021 has a draft plan for potential uses of the funds. These are funds that CARB is also involved in administering. And so there is opportunity to give input on needs related to housing planning and construction in that forum. So I encourage you to go to the SCAG website and look for opportunities for REAP 2021 input.
Thank you. Thank you, Linda.
Last call for questions. I do want to appreciate everyone for participating in the audience as well, asking great questions and providing thoughtful comments and feedback. Housing is a very complex issue. As you know, there's a housing crisis in California. So we're really interested in understanding how we can move forward resolving the climate crisis along with the climate crisis together. So I want to thank again Maura and the research team, Nick and others for a wonderful research study. And if you have any follow-up questions, please reach out to me or Maura. And it looks like there's one last hand up. Go ahead, Elias.
Yeah, I spoke to the real estate division. I'm working with CTR in the Lithium Valley. They're very excited about working with all the state departments because they need to provide housing for 10,000 workers that they're going to hire. And the starting rate is going to be like $25 an hour for that community. That's actually very good. So one of the challenges that they're facing is figuring out which state departments to talk to about providing funding mechanisms, because the funding, again, is a big challenge for these kind of developments. And so they've already procured land, but they don't want to get involved into the housing part of it. So the question they've raised, and they want to talk to your leadership on, is how do they go about working with the state departments as a collaborative? Not because right now we're calling department by department. It's really complicated. So if there's a way that we could speak to the different housing departments that allow A, funding, and B, have oversight on workforce housing, then I think that's something that would be a great opportunity since they're going to build from scratch. So if you have any ideas on that, that'd be great.
Thank you. Yeah, we'll reach out offline. Great points. Thank you. Appreciate them. On that, thank you again, everyone, for your participation. The recording will be available on CARB YouTube channel in a week or so. Thank you again.
Thank you.